It's one of the great mysteries of our time.
There's something weird going on in that area.
For centuries, it has swallowed up its victims.
I'm going down. Repeat, going down.
Who ever heard of 5 aircraft disappearing in one night?
Leaving many buried in an underwater graveyard.
They would explore these wrecks and find bodies at the depths of the ocean.
But is the story more legend than truth?
If you put all the facts down and put it down as nonfiction, people wouldn't believe you.
And what can science tell us?
Lose control of the airplane and went into a spiral dive and would end up with a disaster.
About the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle.
Okay, begin hoist. I'm in. Rescue briefing is complete.
Off the coast of southern Florida, the United States Coast Guard has been searching the skies and seas for a twin-engine private plane with 3 passengers on board. Shortly after 11 a.m., it disappeared from air traffic control radars.
There was an aircraft, a Piper Aztec, that was lost within the area called the Bermuda Triangle this past June of 2005. And the circumstances of that flight are still fairly sketchy. It was a Part 91 flight, which means it's a private flight, conducted under instrument flight rules, which means the pilot is in contact with a radar facility for the entire duration of the flight. Coast Guard would launch some of their resources in the area, both in the form of helicopters and in form of ships, and any other aircraft that might be transiting the area would be asked to either listen for an ELT, an emergency location transmitter, or if they were in VFR conditions, to look for possible survivors.
After an exhaustive 24-hour search, no wreckage, no evidence, no survivors are found. The search is suspended.
Unfortunately, that happens, and some searches will go on for a longer duration, but in general, a search for a light aircraft that disappears off radar in the middle of the ocean, it's a probably 1 or 2 day search at the most, and then those resources are recalled.
This recent tragedy is just the latest in a string of mysteries to unfold over what some call the most treacherous waters on the planet. 500,000 square miles, sometimes referred to as the Bermuda Triangle.
The Bermuda Triangle is where planes take off, never to be seen again, where ships sail over the horizon, never heard from again, yachts disappear from the face of the earth for no known reason. And it's probably the core motivation for more sea stories, legends, and tales of the ocean than any other place in all of the oceans on the earth.
The Bermuda Triangle is an area of the Atlantic Ocean that runs from Miami southeast to Puerto Rico, northeast to Bermuda, and heads west back to Miami. For centuries, the area has been plagued by the unexplained disappearances of planes and ships.
The area known as the Bermuda Triangle has a history, and I guess when something happens out here, it's magnified.
The triangle is so exotic to people and so attractive because it's the last place on Earth that is undiscovered. Everything else has been physically discovered.
As early as the 16th and 17th centuries, European explorers have reported seeing strange lights and finding ships floating intact, but devoid of crew. Author Rob Simone finds this a common thread woven through the triangle's folklore.
But when it comes to the subject of ghost ships, yes, there has been cases reported of ghost ships from many different wayfaring cultures.
In 1780, the warship General Gates disappears. yet no British vessel claims to sink her. During the 19th century, at least 3 more stories of ghost ships surface. Cargo and merchant vessels are found silently riding the waves without anyone on board.
I think there are things that happen out at sea that can only be described in terms of mythology or poetry, because they go beyond the limits of our rational thinking.
Throughout the 20th century and still today, commercial, military, and private aircraft have vanished without a trace. The most famous case is that of Flight 19, when 5 Navy planes disappeared in 1945. In his 2004 book about the Bermuda Triangle, John Quasar suggests that the number of mysterious cases are countless.
The old line is that there's been 20 aircraft that have disappeared and 50 vessels that have vanished in the history of the Triangle. And you have some websites, you have some books maybe still repeating that, when actually there's about 200 aircraft disappearances in the last 50 years. And if you count all the yachts and smaller vessels, close to probably 1,000, 2,000, who knows?
Explanations for what has caused these tragedies run from the scientific to the paranormal.
The main theories to explain the Bermuda Triangle have been UFOs. They've been very popular. Power sources from Edgar Cayce's Atlantis. Sea serpents, electromagnetic phenomenon, which bends time and space or can just disintegrate an aircraft or a ship. Many natural causes, mini canes, subsea earthquakes, plain old clumsy pilots and shipmasters. There have been many exotic theories that run the gamut from the very prosaic to the very complex.
The U.S. government officially denies there is anything unusual about the area. In fact, the U.S. Board of Geographic Names doesn't even recognize the name Bermuda Triangle.
From my understanding, any branch of the government has gone on record to say that there is a mystery happening here. No. It's really not their business to do so, and it's really not in their best interest to do it either. There's a combination of factors at work in this particular area. Beyond the myths, beyond the legends, beyond the speculations, it is a dangerous and mysterious part of the ocean.
But are there other explanations that have not yet been fully explored?
Well, I think certainly you can explain a lot of the disappearances due to the weather. The inclement weather that comes in very quickly, and the sailors that are not prepared for it, whether they had too much sail up or they ran into some strong winds from a waterspout or a hurricane or whatever. But I also think there are things out there that we haven't investigated enough, like bubbling of a gas from the ocean, which could reduce the buoyancy of ships. Certainly that could affect whether they made it to port or not.
Despite scientific explanations, the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle is as strong today as it's ever been. The legend began in the era of Columbus, but did not take hold until the last half of the 20th century. That's when new theories erupted about the Triangle's most perplexing disappearance.
Flight 19, which is probably going to be the most talked of mystery of the Triangle.
Sir, I'm going down! I'm going down! Repeat, going down!
December 5th, 1945, 5 pilots and their 9 crew members set out on a routine training mission. Their flight plan will take them to the heart of the Bermuda Triangle. Within hours after their takeoff from Fort Lauderdale, the planes and the crew disappear without a trace, never to be found.
The famous Flight 19 of the World War II era out of Fort Lauderdale has been hyped over the years. Again, it's one of those stories that has been built upon and built upon as it's been passed around.
When it comes to the Flight 19 legend, I seriously doubt that were it not for this particular case, we simply would not have a Bermuda Triangle mystery to this day.
It was the disappearance of Flight 19 that spurred some writers to search back in time for other unexplained incidents in and over the waters of the Triangle. They would discover ancient tales of people and even whole ships lost at sea.
Long before it got its name, its Bermuda Triangle, there were legends of a Sea of Doom, graveyard of the Atlantic, Sargasso graveyard, and they all called to mind an area where ships mysteriously disappeared or were found derelict. So when Flight 19 disappeared in 1945, writers made the connection between these old legends.
In 1950, the Associated Press published an article that compiled many of the region's unexplained incidents. Other news reports followed.
Then in 1952, it finally got its name as the Watery Triangle by George X. Sand, who wrote an article in Fate magazine. And throughout the 1950s, it was known as the Deadly Triangle.
Bermuda Triangle's become such a legend because there's so much hype about it. The Bermuda Triangle really didn't become much of anything until 1964.
That's when journalist Vincent Gaddis coined the phrase Bermuda Triangle in a magazine article for Argosy. The legend began to spread. Media coverage of the Bermuda Triangle mostly relayed stories of vanished planes and ships. Few forwarded any theories to explain the mysterious disappearances. But in 1974, 10 years after the Argosy article, a book called The Bermuda Triangle, An Incredible Saga of Unexplained Disappearances, was written by Charles Berlitz.
Berlitz's book was more or less theories based on the incidents, while other books were mostly just a compilation of incidents without any insight whatsoever.
Berlitz's book was the first to suggest that disappearances, like Flight 19, were caused by mysterious energy anomalies, aliens, and even the lost city of Atlantis.
His book sold 5 million copies in hardback, and that's what really gave the area its enigma, and everybody wanted to talk about the Triangle.
About the same time, filmmaker Richard Weiner produced a documentary about the phenomenon. In it, he gave the region a more ominous name.
Well, I like the name the Devil's Triangle better because Bermuda Triangle sounds too much like a honeymoon with a mother-in-law or ex-boyfriend going along.
Weiner takes issue with more than the name of the region. He also questions its shape.
The Bermuda Triangle is an area, they say it's a triangle, but it's not really. It's really a trapezoid. A trapezoid is a rectangle with no two sides or two angles the same.
His film, chronicling the area's bizarre disturbances and unexplained tragedies, became an instant cult classic.
I thought, well, geez, I'm going to do a film on this. So I was doing a lot of freelance work, and every place I went around this area, supposedly the Triangle, whether Bermuda or Puerto Rico or somewhere in the Caribbean, I would shoot some background footage for this movie. And I had it all pieced together, and then I started researching and getting people that were involved in it, first-hand eyewitnesses. I mean, the way they told it, these people lived through it. And they started, one of them was telling about ships that sailed off, never to be seen again, airplanes that flew into the clouds, never to come back, yachts that sailed off, never to be heard from.
Books and movies established the Bermuda Triangle in pop culture. They also reported that the area's unexplained incidents could be traced back for centuries. Early sailors crossing the Atlantic feared a region known as the Sargasso Sea.
In the Bermuda Triangle, there are a number of escarpments, they call them, and there's deep channels. These channels are a mile deep. You have the Sargasso Sea, and you go down to the abyssal plains. Those are 20,000 feet deep, so you get a perspective of the change in the topography of the bottom.
For centuries, ships have sailed into the Sargasso and been immobilized by a lack of wind and motionless current.
The earliest alleged Bermuda Triangle incident goes as far back as Christopher Columbus in 1492. And they got into an area known as the Sargasso Sea, which is kind of a large circling area with a lot of seaweed and clutter and things like that.
It was these massive deposits of seaweed, waste, and red krill that ancient mariners and Sargasso travelers often mistook for sea serpents.
The triangle is not a superstition of seafarers or in the ports. The enigma of the triangle can be found as far back as Columbus's log, who was the first to sail the area. He noted that on 3 occasions the compass pointed in the wrong direction, 11 1/4 degrees off from the evening reading to the morning reading, which was unexplainable. They also noted that the sea rose without any wind whatsoever, which shocked them all. And then on the eve of discovering the New World, an unexplained light levitated on the horizon and then rose up and then vanished.
And you have to think about that for a second. This man was a seasoned sailor. There wasn't much that goes on in the night sky that he or his crew hadn't already seen. So for him to make such a special notation about this event, that speaks volumes.
However, not everyone considers Columbus to have been a masterful sailor.
And of course, when they were crossing the ocean, they were legitimately afraid of what they were getting into, because everybody thought the world was flat and they were going to drop off at the edge. And one of the stories is that Columbus saw a UFO, and another one is he saw a strange light at night when they were way out in the ocean. My research on that was Columbus did make a note in his log about a bright light overhead, and all the historians have always assumed that that was a meteorite that flashed across the sky. And another part of the story about Columbus is that the compass was acting strange.
You know, the tools that Columbus had basically was he had a compass, and he had a astrolabe, and he had a log, and those things were imprecise.
If the strange occurrences witnessed by Columbus's crew might be explained so simply, then what can account for the ships found in the Bermuda Triangle with their entire crews missing? Miami's inland waters are choppy, and the forecast calls for 6-foot-high waves. Either undaunted or unaware, Dan Burak, aboard his cabin cruiser, the Witchcraft, sets sail with his friend Patrick Hogan to view the colorful Christmas lights draped across the beachfront. Moments later, their plans change.
Burak radioed the Coast Guard that he needed a tow back in. Something had happened. Either he hit something or lost power. He was well noted for his safety precautions. He had built-in flotation in the vessel. All of his seat cushions were floatable.
In Miami, the Coast Guard immediately dispatched a rescue team.
They were there at 9:18, and there was no trace of the Witchcraft. They scoured the whole area. They even searched 1,500 miles out to sea. It disappeared. You can't say anything else. It should not have disappeared. It should have been found. It is simply part of the enigma of the triangle.
Disappearances, such as that of the Witchcraft, seemingly are nothing new here.
I don't know how many instances there are where people are not recovered from having some difficulty in the triangle.
For at least 3 centuries, ships and their passengers have apparently vanished. Passed down, these legends caused 19th century seamen to nickname the area we now know as the Bermuda Triangle as the Sea of Doom and the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Treasure hunter Madeline Burnside has learned how to navigate these underwater cemeteries.
The Florida Keys become a real shipwreck graveyard. Shipwrecks here are actually piled up. You locate a 19th century wreck, and that will have some interest, but as you dig down, there'll be an 18th century wreck, and under that, a 17th century wreck.
One of the earliest claims of an unexplained disappearance in the Triangle happened in 1780, when the United States warship, the General Gates, was inexplicably lost.
The ship simply disappeared between far-flung ports, and no one knew what happened to it.
Many other mysteries purported to have taken place inside the triangle are similar in nature. In 1840, the French ship the Rosalie was found adrift with its cargo intact. But as for the crew, it's not that they were found dead, but that they were never found at all. Larry Cush, author of The Bermuda Triangle Solved, is skeptical about the account of the Rosalie.
Nobody has presented any proof that it's a mystery. In the case of the Rosalie in 1840, it was found drifting about in the Bahamas somewhere, and try as hard as I could contacting all the sources that I could in the Bahamas and Lloyd's of London and all these places, I could not find any evidence that any ship named the Rosalie had a problem in there, that ship ever existed.
But there are many strange stories of lost ships connected to the triangle.
The Mary Celeste in, I believe it was 1872, was found abandoned at sea, and the usual thing with an abandoned ship, there was food on the table, it was in perfect order, and nobody could understand why it had been abandoned at sea, and the people were never found.
Bound for Genoa, the Mary Celeste carried a crew of 10. When the Celeste was found on the 4th of December, the search party discovered cups of coffee, still warm, set upon a table, undisturbed. While the Mary Celeste case is documented, Larry Cush claims it is part of a Bermuda Triangle myth.
The Mary Celeste is not at all a mystery of the Bermuda Triangle because it happened about 3,000 miles to the east.
Regardless, stories of doomed ships and crews that vanish dominate triangle lore. If at least some of these cases are true, what could be the cause?
Piracy has been around as long as ships have set sail. Out on the high seas, it's every man for himself. That's part of the excitement. It's also part of the danger.
According to experts, the area of the Bermuda Triangle was a favorite playground for some of history's most notorious pirates.
Right around the Keys, and especially the Bermuda Triangle, the pirates were sailing around this area because it's directly through the trade route from South America, Latin America, Cartagena, through to Europe. The most common pirates around the area were Blackbeard, which everybody knows about, Calico Jack, who's most famous for having the 2 women pirates, and also Black Caesar.
Some of these ships might have run afoul of some pretty nasty pirates. Their ships could have been plundered, their people sold into slavery, or worse, thrown off the side.
Another theory floated is that a ship's crew could have been wiped out by diseases carried by slaves.
But there is also a particular thing that happened fairly commonly, and that is that both the crew and the Africans would contract ophthalmia, which renders you blind. There are known cases of both the crew and of course the Africans dying in huge numbers. A lot of people freaked out and really just jumped into the ocean because they were terrified. They didn't want to live day-to-day blind.
But neither disease nor piracy explains one of the most unusual triangle legends. On March 4th, 1918, the Cyclops, a 542-foot Navy collier, left Barbados bound for Norfolk, Virginia. On board was a crew of 309 men.
USS Cyclops was coming up from South America, and it had a load of iron ore on it. It was a U.S. Navy ship, and it disappeared. And that added to the story of the Devil's Triangle and the Bermuda Triangle.
Strangely, although the Cyclops was among the first ships ever radio-equipped, it never issued so much as even the most preliminary SOS.
I can't come out with the right adjectives to describe what happened aboard that ship. If you put all the facts down and put it down as nonfiction, people wouldn't believe you. They say, this has to be fiction. This can't be true.
The Navy suspected the boat was attacked by an enemy submarine. But many years later, another fantastic theory emerged to explain the loss of the Cyclops and other missing vessels.
I think among the most famous fabled dangers of the Bermuda Triangle is the infamous giant squid. This giant thing comes up, it's got a hand-like form, it clasps the tiny ship, which is actually a huge ship that is now terrified because this thing is even more giant, and it pulls it down for purposes unknown. But that is part of the whole myth.
While at first glance it sounds far-fetched, the existence of a species of cephalopod called the giant octopus is no myth.
In 1896, a carcass was found on the beach in St. Augustine by two boys, and they reported it to Yale University, and it would have been 200 feet long.
At the time, scientists identified the carcass as a giant octopus. Based in part on this finding, in 1918, the Literary Digest speculated that a giant octopus might have seized upon the Cyclops and brought it down with its tentacles. The St. Augustine carcass turned out to be a section of whale. Dr. Jeff Marliov studies octopus behavior at the Vancouver Aquarium.
Giant octopus only occur in the northeast Pacific Ocean. The kind of octopus that might occur in the region of the Bermuda Triangle would be a very small species, and it would most likely be associated with rocky drop-offs from the islands, not with the center area of the Bermuda Triangle, which is basically sand bottom. Now, when people talk about giant octopuses attacking boats, it likely stems from these very old stories from the days of whaling and sailing ship exploration, when there were engravings showing some kind of tentacled animal attacking small rowboats and such. Most likely this would not be an octopus. The only species that could conceivably attack a small boat would be relatives of octopuses, the giant squids.
Ah, the legend of the giant squid. Actually, it's not a legend. They exist. Some of them over 150 feet long, if you can imagine this.
In October 2005, Japanese scientists made a startling discovery off the coast of Tokyo, near the Bonin Islands. A giant squid, close to 30 feet in length. Researchers from Japan's National Science Museum identified the creature as an Architeuthis, a rare species that seizes upon bait with extreme force and violence.
We don't know what lies under the depths of the ocean. Could very well be a giant creature that is particular to that part of the ocean. Maybe its food source is contained there. We don't know. But it could explain some of the ships that were mysteriously lost.
Giant sea monsters are not the only theory attempting to explain disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle. Some believe that the answer may lie far beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, in the lost city of Atlantis. Among the more creative explanations for strange occurrences within the boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle is one that has roots in ancient Greece, with the lost city of Atlantis.
Atlantis is a story told by Plato approximately 400 BC. It is a story of a civilization that he described as being larger than Asia and Africa combined, that sank into the Atlantic Ocean outside the Pillars of Hercules. He described it in great detail. It had giant palaces and gold-encrusted decorations and springs that ran hot and cold running water, and it grew all kinds of stuff.
But Atlantis met with a swift and violent demise.
He actually described an island continent of Atlantis. And that continent exploded volcanically, and then he described it having this catastrophe, a natural catastrophe of volcanic explosions and sinking into the sea in a very short period of time.
The mystery of where the lost city of Atlantis lies has inspired historians and fortune seekers alike. In the 1930s, the famous clairvoyant Edgar Cayce believed he had solved the mystery when he was contacted by the soul of an Atlantean while in a trance.
Edgar Cayce was a prophet, a visionary, who lost his voice when he was a teenager and couldn't talk anymore. And so he communicated by telling people in this hoarse whisper what he had dreamt. And he had all these dreams, and what started on the basis of his dreams was this enormous society that still exists.
Cayce was convinced that the lost civilization lay under the sea, where the island of Bimini now stands, sitting in the eye of the Bermuda Triangle.
Cayce said that Atlantis existed as a civilization 50,000 years ago, and it was going to rise up from the sea in 1968 in the Bahamas.
Bill Donato dives in the waters around Bimini in search of artifacts from Atlantis.
Most people don't realize that the Bahamas, for example, were a very large landmass of thousands of square miles before the end of the Pleistocene. Around 9,600. In fact, the islands out there would be 7 miles from shore as opposed to what they are now. And in the Bahamas, Bimini would literally have been a mountain. It would be the highest point.
If there was indeed an advanced civilization that sank into the sea, then its technology would also have been lost to the watery depths. According to Cayce and his followers, powerful Atlantean crystals that generate light-emitting energy may still remain buried.
According to Cayce, the great crystal itself, the way he describes it, suggested it was something that was cylindrical, that he'd found a quartz source that was growing near something that was naturally radioactive.
Could it be that the power these crystals emit is so strong that it could cause ships and planes to disappear? As far-fetched as this may seem, reports of magnetic anomalies in the Bermuda Triangle have been recorded, lending another thread of possibility to those who believe.
Well, I believe that if there was an Atlantis, and they were advanced, that they probably did have some way to harness this energy.
But not everyone is convinced.
I don't know how somebody would think that Atlantis would be causing this. I don't know if they're like death rays from Atlantis or something. So I have never been able to figure out why anybody would think that Atlantis has anything to do with disappearing ships and airplanes.
To prove that Atlantis really does exist at this site, Edgar Cayce's followers point to a long, smooth configuration of rocks that appear to have been fitted together by human hands. A 200-foot-long structure known to some as the Bimini Wall and others as the Bimini Road.
The Bimini Wall is, as originally discovered, was a series of what looked like large paving stones underwater. And scuba divers found these things and could not explain them in geological terms. And so they therefore made the assumption that this must be somehow related to some underwater city, perhaps Atlantis.
In order to investigate the theory that a magnetic force emanating from Atlantis could cause planes and ships to disappear in the triangle, one has first to determine whether the story of Atlantis is real in the first place. At the United States Geological Survey in St. Petersburg, Florida, geologist Eugene Shin has spent more than 30 years studying the formations near Bimini.
Back in the mid-70s, I got involved in looking at the famous road or wall, depending on what you call it, off of Bimini. Many people thought that was something to do with Atlantis. I would admit that when you see it underwater, it's very impressive and has a man-made look to it.
Shin bore down into the structure and took core samples from several parts of the wall. Back at his lab, he analyzed the rocks to determine their age, makeup, and origin.
We sliced these cores so that we could see if the bedding was dipping that way or this way or so on. Then we x-rayed them to make the bedding show up better. What we did not find is any evidence of anything made by humans.
But those who believe in the lost city of Atlantis are undeterred by the findings.
I do have belief in the facts that Atlantis is a historical fact. Although we don't have artifacts, I believe eventually it will be proven historically that Atlantis did exist. But so far as being the principal civilization that's called Atlantis, I don't believe that the Bahamas was that place.
If Atlantis does not exist under Bimini, then the theory of energy crystals disrupting ships and planes in the triangle may be nothing more than fantasy.
The Bermuda Triangle and Atlantis have really nothing in common except that they're both mythological, made-up stories.
But there is nothing mythological about the single most persistent case used to substantiate claims of a Bermuda Triangle mystery.
Both of my compasses are out!
The disappearance of Flight 19. December 5th, 1945. As the afternoon sun begins its journey to the west, the crew of the ill-fated Flight 19 takes off toward the east on the first leg of their sortie. The official weather observations from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, Florida, indicate winds are starting to gust, blowing toward the east at over 30 knots. And clouds are forming at various altitudes.
When they took off, the wind, we had prevailing winds, trade winds coming from the southeast, and that's our prevailing winds in South Florida and the Bahamas. But during their flight, we got a weather change.
The 5 aircraft, Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, are piloted by Ensign Joseph Bossy, Second Lieutenant James Gerber, Captain George Stivers, Captain Joseph Powers, Jr., and Lieutenant Charles Taylor, the flight leader. Each plane carries a pilot, bombardier, and gunner, except for one, whose gunner, Alan Kozner, is curiously unable to make the flight.
He had a strange feeling that he didn't want to fly that day, and so he begged off and got out of that flight.
The mission calls for the team to fly east for 56 miles towards Hen and Chicken Shoals, part of the Bahama Island chain, to conduct a low-level bombing exercise. David White was a flight instructor stationed at Fort Lauderdale during the time of the Flight 19 tragedy.
Flight 19, on the day that they turned up missing, was on a routine navigational training flight. And that is to fly out to the Hen and Chicken Islands, about 60 miles straight east of here. And we had a sunken ship out there that we used to drop miniature smoke bombs on. And so as an instructor, I would fly down low to the water, circle around, and score the students as they dropped their smoke bombs.
The first signs of trouble appear just 2 hours into the flight.
Howard! What heading does your compass read?
Flight 19 mystery is that the flight instructor, he said that his compasses were out. Well, if you're in a thunderstorm, there were thunderstorms in the area. A thunderstorm will make a magnetic compass spin, and you just kind of lose control.
This is not...
But none of the airmen report a storm. The 5 pilots compare compass readings,
Can you repeat that?
but none can agree on the direction they are heading.
I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost on that last turn.
Near Flight 19's operational base in Fort Lauderdale, a pilot overhears Taylor and Powers debating their present course. Lieutenant Robert Cox tries to lend assistance.
This is Foxtrot Tango 7-4. Plane or boat calling Powers. Please identify yourself so that someone can help you. Both of my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it's broken.
Cox tells Taylor to orient his plane by positioning the western sun on his port side, and instructs Taylor to lead the squadron northward as Cox flies to the south.
But it was a very unusual circumstance. I've flown over that flight so many times, that route, and there's no way that when you're out over the ocean here off the east coast of Florida and you get lost, well, go to the west, fly west toward the sun. He didn't do it.
I know where I am now. I'm at 2,300 feet. Do not come after me. Roger, you're at 2,300 feet. I'm coming to meet you anyhow.
Lieutenant Cox flies around the southern tip of the mainland and the Florida Keys in conditions described as CAVU, or Clear and Visibility Unlimited. He sees no sign of the 5 Avengers, but hears intermittent radio transmissions from Flight 19 growing fainter.
Do you read?
To the east, the skies over the Bahamas are shrouded in low clouds.
I think a well-prepared flight would not get into that kind of confusion. If you're depending on what you see down below when you're looking at the Bahamas or the Florida Keys, and if that is your crutch or your dependence for navigation, then I can see where things could get very confused.
The Navy's Air-Sea Rescue Task Unit overhears a transmission between the Flight 19 pilots that reveals at least one of them thinks they are flying in the wrong direction. Radio operators up and down the Florida coast strain to hear the pilots' fading voices.
Repeat once again. This is Foxtrot Tango 28.
This, what you might call a tragedy of errors, rather than a comedy of errors, at least 1 or 2 of the pilots of the planes in the flight were heard on the air saying, well, let's fly due west. We certainly can do no worse if we're lost than flying due west. They didn't say all of that, but they were urging the flight leader to get the flight on a heading of due west, and that would have been smart.
Minute by minute, radio operators try every possible frequency to make contact with Flight 19. Only the distant voices of the pilots are heard, questioning their course, their fuel, their fate.
When the first man gets to his last 10 gallons of gas, we'll all land in the water together. Does everyone understand? Sir, can you repeat that?
At 7:04, the last transmission is received from Flight 19. The pilots are never heard from again. Within minutes, the Navy dispatch a Martin Mariner with a crew of 13 to search for the missing planes. But soon, radio communication with the Mariner is also lost.
So this added to the mystery. Now they had this search plane that was also missing.
The SS Gaines Mill, patrolling off the waters of Cape Canaveral, witnesses a giant fireball slowly fall from the sky. The ship races to the point of impact, only to find an oil slick shimmering on the surface. Additional search and rescue units are deployed. Franklin Daly is one of the hundreds who try to find the missing aviators.
And we spent about 4 hours just combing the ocean, just making tracks up and down the Atlantic Ocean to see if we could see what we presume might be some wreckage or life preserver or something from one of those aircraft. We never saw anything.
So in one night, 6 aircraft and 27 naval personnel simply vanished without trace.
The search for Flight 19 lasts 5 days, ending on December 10, 1945. A board of investigation immediately gathers radio logs, transcripts, charts, weather data, and testimonies to determine what went wrong. On January 24th, they conclude that the primary reason for the disappearance of Flight 19 is the confusion of flight leader Charles Taylor. But objections to the determinations from the pilots' families and naval personnel initiates a review of the facts by the Navy's Judge Advocate General, or JAG. On August 23, 1946, the official determination is reversed, stating that Lieutenant Taylor had been blamed erroneously for the unfortunate incident, and the 5 planes disappeared as a result of causes or reasons unknown.
Flight 19 is so famous because whoever heard of 5 aircraft disappearing in one night? At the time, the popular press associated so many dramatic lines with the flight. Supposedly the last words coming from it are, "I am lost." And after that, there was nothing ever reported, so it was quite dramatic the way it was reported.
As far as Bermuda Triangle mysteries goes, Flight 19 is by far the biggest mystery. It was a very confusing incident.
What really happened to Flight 19 and the 27 men lost that December night? Is there more to the story than pilot error? Were there mysterious forces at work? What can scientific investigation discover about the fate of Flight 19? Like a needle in a haystack, the answers are out there, hidden somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. In a region plagued by shipwrecks and plane crashes, one 1945 accident begs a closer look.
Flight 19 is one of these cases which, regardless of which theory people go for, to a great extent still defies explanation. And, you know, it wasn't just one aircraft that vanished, it was a whole fleet of aircraft.
So what is the most likely cause of the most legendary of all Bermuda Triangle mysteries? Aviation accident investigator Peter Leffey has examined all available flight records and reconstructed the facts of Flight 19 minute by minute. The first unusual notation comes from before the squadron even left the ground.
Well, the significant aspect of that is that the flight commander, Lieutenant Taylor, asked to be relieved of his obligation for the flight. He arrived at the briefing room late. The flight was late taking off because of his tardiness, and it was never explained why he wanted to be relieved of command that day, whether or not he had any psychological problems, any stress on him, he wasn't feeling well medically.
But the flight leader's request was denied. Other than Taylor's questionable health, he was an accomplished pilot.
Taylor, who was the flight commander, had approximately 2,500 hours. He was a well-qualified pilot, although he wasn't particularly familiar with this area. The other pilots all had in the range of 300 hours, which we would all consider quite a low-time pilot.
Already behind schedule, Taylor and his students finally depart on the first leg of their mission.
Flight 19 was a military training flight that left Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and went out to the east over the Atlantic Ocean to do some bombing practice.
Afterwards, the flight continues to the east.
Then turn to a north-northwest heading, which would bring him up this way for a fixed number of miles, and then make a turn to the southwest and like this, which would have brought him right back into Fort Lauderdale.
The training mission includes a basic navigation exercise learned by all pilots, ironically called dead reckoning.
Well, dead reckoning navigation is a form of navigation where you use time, speed, and distance So it doesn't rely on ground-based radio navigation aids.
A critical component to planning such a flight is consideration of prevailing wind currents.
Well, the winds were primarily from the southwest or west-southwest, so they would actually add airspeed or ground speed to the flight. So they might have been getting in the area of 20 to 25 knots of push, and that push would have moved them even further out than they were anticipating.
Less than 2 hours into the mission, the first sign of trouble. Commander Taylor senses something is wrong.
At some point, either during the second leg or during the third leg, when they turn to the north-northwest on a heading of, I believe, 346 degrees true, that Taylor became convinced that they somehow had made a wrong turn.
I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost on that last turn.
Taylor next reports problems with his compass.
Howard! What heading does your compass read?
Pilots are typically trained, particularly in instrument conditions, to rely on their instruments and not to fly by the seat of the pants.
Without a compass, Taylor relies on the horizon and landmarks for direction.
Both of my compasses are out. I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm overland, but it's broken.
He was seeing land, and he had been formerly based in Miami and had been familiar with the Keys. He said, we're over the Keys. I don't know how we got here, but we're over the Florida Keys. And at this point in time, he's so disoriented that he thinks he's in the Gulf of Mexico.
According to radio transmission transcripts, Taylor's confusion about his location is overheard by another pilot flying above the mainland.
This is Foxtrot Tango 7-4. Plane or boat calling Powers. Please identify yourself so that someone can help you.
Flight number 74, commanded by Lieutenant Cox. And part of the conversation was that Taylor communicated to Cox that he felt he was over the Florida Keys and he needed to find his way back to Fort Lauderdale.
Communication between the pilots is fading.
Repeat once again. This is Foxtrot Tango 28.
In the case of these Flight 19 flying easterly out into the ocean, it should be obvious that the farther you got away from the receiving station, the weaker the signal would get. Eventually, you get out of range of the station and you don't receive the signal at all.
And as Cox flew south, the transmissions between the two aircraft became weaker and weaker. They were diverging rather than converging. And that is significant evidence that helps us be sure that Taylor was never anywhere near the Florida Keys.
Radio operators on the mainland mark Flight 19's position far from the Gulf Coast of Florida.
According to the triangulation that they determined from radio triangulation, he was somewhere out here in the Atlantic Ocean, about up in this area, I would say.
These reports indicate that Taylor was flying over the Bahama Islands and mistook them for the Florida Keys. In radio logs, Peter Leffey has discovered a clue that illustrates Taylor's worsening confusion.
This is MT-28. I read you. Not clear, but I read you.
When he started calling himself MT-28 instead of FT-28, that was a clear indication that his mental function was starting to diminish, and he's under the belief that he's somewhere where he isn't. Now, all of these things could be consistent with his mental status not being up to par, and that relates back to his asking to be relieved of command on that particular day.
Could Taylor's health have actually impaired his ability to fly the plane? Pilot fatigue and confusion is a very real problem in aviation. Ronald Oberholzer is the chief instructor for American Flying Academy. He demonstrates a life-threatening condition called spatial disorientation, which can occur when a pilot's vision becomes blurred or his visual reference is limited.
I put a pair of goggles on that restricted my vision, and I turned my head down so that I couldn't see the instruments in the airplane. And I attempted to fly the airplane solely by my body motion, how my body felt, what it was telling me that I was doing. And we found out that I can't, even as an experienced pilot, that I cannot keep the airplane straight and level under those conditions. And eventually, in a very short period of time, the airplane ended up in a right turn with the nose down and is accelerating. That's what we call a spiral dive. And of course, at that point, I looked up and referenced my instruments in the outside and righted the airplane. But that's a demonstration of what can happen.
If Taylor was disoriented and flying with inaccurate instruments, why didn't he defer navigation to one of the student pilots?
Those pilots are really relying on the flight commander to make the ultimate decision. And the flight commander in this case was completely confused and totally lost as far as where he thought he was versus where he was. The flight started to proceed on a heading of 270 back towards land. And there was a fix obtained on the flight off of New Smyrna, Florida, approximately 130 miles offshore.
Another transmission is intercepted that reports the flight may have turned back to the east.
And at that location, they had approximately 20 minutes of fuel left. They would have never made land even if they knew where they were.
As the sun sets, the Avengers will be close to running out of fuel.
When the first man gets to his last 10 gallons of gas, we'll all land in the water together. Does everyone understand?
And although it's not 100%, and they made a decision that if they were going to go down, they would go down together. I think they felt that they were so lost at this point in time, they weren't going to find land, and that if they were going to ditch, they'd have a better chance of being picked up if they were together.
Knowing that a ditch into rough seas has slim chance of survival, why would the pilots of Flight 19 follow Taylor into the water?
Well, in the military operations like that, where you're doing formation flyings, the pilots are taught to follow the leader, and that's just the way it is. So if the leader makes a mistake and flies into a mountain, usually everybody else in the formation flies into the mountain also.
Official records declare 7:04 p.m. as the final transmission of Flight 19. Hours later, contact is lost with one of the search teams, a Mariner seaplane with a crew of 13.
This aircraft proceeded up the coast of Florida to New Smyrna and then turned east and started flying offshore. And during its course offshore, it disappeared from radar.
There are eyewitness reports of a giant fireball plummeting to the ocean. Is it possible that the missing Mariner blew up? Leffie thinks that's exactly what happened.
It's unusual for an aircraft to explode, but an aircraft like that, loaded with over 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel, high volatility, very, very prone to an in-flight explosion if someone smokes in the aircraft. It's very, very tragic, but really not out of the realm of something that might be ordinary.
Although no wreckage was ever found of the 5 Avengers or the Mariner, investigator Peter Leffie thinks the records speak for themselves.
Well, the conclusions I reached after reviewing a tremendous amount of information about Flight 19 is that there was nothing unusual about it. In most airplane accidents, one finds that it's not a single problem that brings the airplane down. It's a compounding of one problem on top of another problem on top of another problem, until the pilot is overwhelmed with his ability to manage multiple problems simultaneously. And in this case, we start to see a multiplicity of problems: bad weather, disorientation, a belief that he's somewhere where he isn't.
Leffie contends the tragedy is no mystery at all.
But I saw nothing to suggest any anomalies that would suggest anything other than spatial disorientation of the flight leader. I didn't see anything to suggest aliens, supernatural forces, magnetic anomalies, gas clouds, or anything out of the ordinary.
If expert analysis of Flight 19's records can form these logical conclusions, what else can science tell us about this and other mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle? Hurricanes, lightning storms, waterspouts. The region known as the Bermuda Triangle is notorious for erratic, often violent, changes in weather. The United States Coast Guard are exceptionally experienced at responding to distress calls off the sandy Florida beaches. On average, they receive about 8,000 distress calls annually from this area, 700 calls a month, close to 25 calls each day. The Coast Guard attributes most of the accidents to human error, mechanical failure, and the area's harsh weather conditions.
South Florida is prone to having thunderstorms and squalls blow up all the time in this area. Factors that would make these waters difficult to navigate are the same factors we would find anywhere else. People not being prepared, people drinking while boating.
Each year, the Bermuda Triangle is the site of numerous tropical storms and hurricanes. Could some of the many accidents in the Triangle simply be a result of volatile weather?
The Bermuda Triangle is a special area, both meteorologically and oceanographically. It's an area where cold air and warm air meet, and whenever you have two different air masses meeting, you get severe weather.
Bart Hagermeyer is head meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Melbourne, Florida.
We're responsible for forecasting the marine conditions off the east coast of Florida, and we know it's a really wild and dynamic marine environment.
Hagermeyer has been an eyewitness to innumerable hurricanes.
The most awe-inspiring one for us was back in August of 1992 when Hurricane Andrew was moving over the Bahamas, and you could tell just by looking at the radar that it was going to be terrible.
Andrew left 41 dead and caused $25 billion of damage in Florida alone. The 2005 hurricane season was a terrifying reminder of the destructive power that can be spawned in the waters off Florida.
Off the east coast of Florida, the Caribbean, the Bahamas area is a very dynamic area. I mean, weather can evolve rather rapidly. A good example is just we're working the hurricane season here, and we've had 4 storms develop right over the Bahamas area this year, which is really unprecedented.
Hagermeyer and his colleagues don't put much stock in the legends of the Bermuda Triangle. They have more tangible issues to contend with.
With the National Weather Service, we're trying to predict the weather over the land and over the sea, and we've got a big enough challenge, forecasting the weather for the normal without worrying about the paranormal. And our job is to get the forecast and get the information out to try and keep people safe.
The region's powerful storms can often catch both experienced and inexperienced boaters by surprise.
If you're not watching the weather before you go out because you didn't take a safe boating class, you're going to run into trouble. You're going to run into some heavy winds, some heavy rain.
There's the potential for strong currents, strong winds, bad weather, thunderstorms, and all of these things add up to naturally occurring phenomena that increase the probability of an accident.
Adding to the possibility of fatal accidents is the presence of dangerous waterspouts. tornadoes that pass over the sea and pick up a column of water. For centuries, these ocean twisters were a genuine fear for any sailor attempting to navigate the waters of the Bermuda Triangle.
The winds inside a waterspout can get up to at least 190 miles an hour. That is plenty enough wind to spin over a boat.
Storm photographer Jim Edds has witnessed a waterspouts fury firsthand.
Waterspouts come in two types. One is they call a fair weather waterspout, where you have a long, dark, flat base, a cumulus cloud base, and you'll get a column of warm air circulating up. Generally, they're not too strong, they don't move too fast, and they're easy to steer around or get around. The other type is what they call a tornadic waterspout, where you have a supercell, a severe thunderstorm that's rotating, and you have a much more intense waterspout circulating underneath that. Those move a little faster, stronger winds, and more dangerous.
The Florida Keys alone get more than 500 waterspouts a year.
Most waterspouts don't move that fast, but if you're in a boat and say you're down there eating at the galley and you're not paying attention to what's happening in the air, what the clouds are doing, you could sail right into a waterspout. It could flip your boat over and you never hear from them again. You won't know what happened.
With the waters off the coast of Florida plagued by deadly and quick developing storms, could weather have played a part in the loss of Flight 19?
There was surface winds in the range of 20, gusting to 30 knots. So it was a fairly uncomfortable day. There was some clouds, fairly low, 2,500 feet, and the weather, if anything, was starting to deteriorate.
I think I know more about what happened on Flight 19 than anybody else who was not on that flight themselves, anybody alive. The weather was not good that day.
Experts seem to agree that if the squadron encountered a full-blown thunderstorm, the static electricity from lightning could have compromised Flight 19's communications and caused a compass malfunction.
If you're operating a boat or an aircraft into an intense thunderstorm or in the immediate vicinity of lightning, and of course Florida is the lightning capital of the United States, you could have certainly some instrument anomalies.
So chances are they ran into some weather, lost their bearings in the clouds due to the weather because they didn't have the sophisticated electronics equipment that we have today.
If pilot disorientation combined with extreme weather conditions caused the Flight 19 disaster, then might the region's unpredictable weather be the primary reason for other unexplained triangle cases?
There may be other reasons why things have disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle that we don't know yet. So I'm not going to write off everything as due to the weather.
May 2nd, 1998. Captain John Willis sails his boat, the Miss Charlotte, out onto a calm Atlantic Ocean. After a long ride to his favorite spot for fishing, Willis lays down to rest before he starts to fish. Suddenly, the boat rocks violently. A large wave throws the captain from his bed and capsizes the Miss Charlotte, sending her to the ocean floor. An investigation reveals that the accident was caused by a phenomenon known as rogue waves.
In the Bermuda Triangle area, we have some of the world's fastest currents, largest waves, and strongest winds.
Examining these chaotic, violent seas is a passion of marine scientist Arthur Mariano, a professor at the University of Miami.
In the ocean, we have the occurrence of what's known as rogue waves.
The region is known for the prevalence of giant, unpredictable waves that can reach hazardous heights.
Most waves will have a size range, let's say from 8 to 10 feet on the average, but every 100,000th wave that comes by may be 20 feet. These are waves that are 2 to 3 times bigger than the average wave in a fully developed sea. As the wave height doubles, the actual energy that it hits your boat with increases by a factor of 4. A lot of boats can't handle that energy, and these rogue waves can be very destructive.
Obviously, waves of this magnitude could adversely affect vessels.
Large waves that are the result of the severe weather and the strong currents help fuel the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle.
In addition to the destructive waves, the powerful currents in the Bermuda Triangle heighten the chances of shipwrecks. Mariano claims that these currents may solve the riddles of some mysterious disappearances from centuries past.
The strong currents in the Bermuda Triangle have historically caused sailors many problems. In the old days, people sailed by dead reckoning and what was known as shooting the stars, celestial navigation. Strong currents can significantly take you off course and get you confused where you are in the ocean. Now, if you unfortunately are off course, you're far away from land, and a strong storm starts building, the combination of the storm and the currents increasing the average wave height puts you in a very dangerous situation.
One of the unique aspects in the seas of the Bermuda Triangle is also the most treacherous, a liquid superhighway known as the Gulf Stream.
The Gulf Stream system does flow through the Bermuda Triangle. There's a very strong western boundary current that flows from south to north. It's very important in ocean climate dynamics. It brings a lot of heat from south to north. There's two major components to how the ocean currents move material around. One is due to the mean currents, and the Gulf Stream is a very fast mean current, 3, 4, 5 miles an hour.
The powerful Gulf Stream current can pinch off into eddies, small, short-lived whirlpools below the surface of the ocean.
Ocean eddies, they look like tornadoes and hurricanes in the atmosphere. Dynamics are slightly different. However, they're also very energetic features that can cause problems with navigation and also steepen waves. These eddies lead to a phenomenon called turbulent dispersion. That is, if you put a bunch of objects in an ocean, even if it has no mean current, the turbulent dispersion will take those objects and disperse them over a very large area in a short amount of time. And this leads to a very hard search and rescue problem.
Turbulent dispersion may even provide clues as to why no bodies or plane wreckage were ever found from the ill-fated Flight 19.
There is scientific explanations for why those planes are missing. My best guess is that Flight 19 ended up in the ocean due to bad weather. And once they were on the ocean surface, the large waves during a storm event ripped those planes apart. Some of the planes sank in areas, and we don't know exactly where they sank, but this happened in an area where the flow of the Gulf Stream was 3, 4, 5 knots.
Using a wave tank, Mariano was able to demonstrate what may have happened to the debris from Flight 19.
What we're going to do in this wave tank right here is look at the dispersion of dye at the surface. Now, of course, an airplane is metal, and it disperses much differently than dye. We're going to look under a couple different conditions. We're going to look under very calm conditions, and as you look here at the dye during these calm conditions, what you see is that the dye disperses fairly slowly. Now, when we crank up the system here, we see that the dye disperses much more rapidly. This very simple experiment gives us an idea that what possibly could have happened on that day is that the plane went down and quickly dispersed and then sunk to the ocean bottom.
Mariano applies computer animation to further illustrate his dispersion theory.
If a boat breaks down in the Bermuda Triangle, it can experience real strong currents that will push a great distance. So whatever wreckage was left of those planes that didn't sink would get quickly dispersed all over the ocean. You could see in this video in 36 hours, and then by 72 hours, the region that the wreckage can be found is 10,000 square miles. This is definitely a case of trying to find a needle in a haystack when you don't know the initial location and you're in a region of very large dispersion. So it would be extremely difficult to find that squadron.
The Bermuda Triangle's perilous waters seem to be a logical cause for many of the region's so-called unexplained accidents and shipwrecks. But can science refute every fantastic triangle theory?
This fog has an electromagnetic energy within it. And once it captured us, our electronic instruments and the magnetic instruments, they all started malfunctioning.
In the scientific community, the Bermuda Triangle is really no mystery at all. Most experts believe cases of planes gone missing and ships vanishing can be explained by science.
When situations happen where a plane goes down or a vessel is lost, more oftentimes than not, it's error on the operator not having the knowledge that he needs to navigate the waters, or it's a mechanical problem with the plane or the vessel.
Others assert that strange and puzzling forces plague the region. But sometimes their theories straddle a fine line between science fact and science fiction. In 1970, Bruce Gernon experienced an event in the skies above the Bermuda Triangle that forever changed his life. While flying his airplane over the Bahamas, Gernon entered into an unusual cloud bank that seemed to appear out of nowhere.
It was like a typical cloud inside with practically no visibility. This little lenticular cloud had spread out into an immense squall, but it was like no other squall I had ever seen because it appeared to be circular. As far as I could see, it was a semicircle spread out on either side of me 10 miles in the shape of a huge donut. And I flew along the edge of the storm in a southerly direction, hoping that I would find an escape route. And it looked like there wasn't any because it just kept continuing in a circle.
While caught inside this strange circular storm, Gernon claims he saw a tunnel through the clouds. To this day, he believes it was his only way out.
Immediately upon entry into this tunnel, a bizarre thing happened. Lines instantly formed all around the walls of the tunnel. And they were like little puffs of clouds that created these lines. And they continued the whole length of the tunnel. And I noticed that they were rotating very slowly counterclockwise. I aimed for the other end of the tunnel, and it should have taken me about 3 minutes to reach the other end. But it only took 20 seconds. It was incredible, because I believe I was actually seeing time when I saw those lines. And I was actually seeing and flying through the fabric of time itself.
Gernon calls the eerie mist into which he flew electronic fog.
This fog has an electromagnetic energy within it. And once it captured us, when we exited the tunnel, our electronic instruments and the magnetic instruments, mainly, they all started malfunctioning. There was no blue sky. Everything was gray, a strange gray.
Gernon maintains that it took him only 3 minutes to traverse through the entire area of electronic fog, a journey that would normally take 30 minutes. He compares it to entering a wormhole in space.
Well, this is new science. They're discovering that there are many wormholes out there. And I believe there are wormholes right here on Earth.
Wormholes are hypothetical connections between widely separated regions of space and time.
It may sound far-fetched, but it's not that far-fetched when you get into subatomic sciences. You have particles reappearing and disappearing all the time. And on a grand, large scale, this could be applicable to, let's say, aircraft in the Bermuda Triangle region.
Believers in the theory that the Bermuda Triangle is an area of wormholes and energy vortices often cite the work of self-educated physicist John Hutchison.
I know Bruce Gernon and his experiences with the Bermuda Triangle because I felt the same thing when I was working on my equipment. I walked right into this electronic fog. I didn't even see it. I walked into it, and it seemed like I was inside a fog, and I would walk back, and everything was clear as day. By somebody being rather unlucky getting into one of these areas, let's say a ship or an aircraft, and all of a sudden it either disappears or they go off course and crash somewhere, or they're pulled down. The whole area of the triangle is not that active. It's a wandering force that goes around in that region.
But wormholes, time travel, and electronic fog are largely rejected by the scientific community.
We've had some strange reports over the years, but no, I've never heard of anybody sucked into a time tunnel.
The National Weather Service probably won't be investigating electronic fog anytime soon.
No, I've never heard of electronic fog. We're busy enough, obviously dealing with meteorological fog.
Meteorological fog is a very real and well-documented weather condition. It can wreak havoc on boats and planes trying to travel through it. And the area of the Bermuda Triangle has the perfect conditions to create this navigational hazard.
It occurs when the air temperature is cooled to the point of the dew point, and that causes fog. And a good example of that is if you have cold air moving off, behind a cold front, and front stalls out over the Gulf Stream, that you've got perhaps still 80-some degree water temperatures, so the immediate air temperature there close to the surface is in the low 80s, and you may have 40 or 50 degree air temperatures above that, and that certainly can cause an area of near zero visibility and sea fog.
Hagermeyer and his colleagues at the National Weather Service have yet to identify anomalies lurking within meteorological fog.
Sometimes we get just the right conditions, and sea fog can persist for quite a while off the east coast of Florida. That's the only kind of fog that I'm familiar with.
But Bruce Gernon believes the fog he traveled through had a unique aspect to it, one that has yet to be explained by science, and one that he believes may have been a factor in some triangle incidents.
Dozens of pilots have been in it, and I believe that dozens more have been in it and died.
Gernon believes that, like him, the lost pilots from Flight 19 may very well have encountered electronic fog.
Flight 19 encountered something very similar to what I did when I was in the electronic fog. They were only about 30 miles north of the time tunnel that I flew through. And their first report of entering this electronic fog was at 3:30 in the afternoon. That's the exact time that I was captured by this fog, only almost exactly 25 years later. I'm not sure if they experienced any time slips, but they definitely became totally disoriented because it did affect their instruments. Their magnetic compasses weren't working. None of them could figure out which way was west. It also affected their electronic instruments. They had an instrument that pointed back to Fort Lauderdale, and all they had to do was follow the needle.
While experts discount the electronic fog theory, could regular fog have contributed to the mysterious disappearance of Flight 19?
Back at the time of Flight 19, there's really no reliable weather data other than a few isolated weather reports, so it's pretty easy to see how events that happened in the past where there wasn't a lot of detailed weather data available, they may not necessarily think that weather is a factor, but it may well could have been.
John Quasar believes the weather was indeed a factor on the night of December 5th, 1945. He proposes a new theory that places Flight 19 over land.
The entire Florida coast was completely covered by low cloud cover. It would have been impossible for them to have seen land, and Avengers had no landing lights for whatever extraordinary reason that was. They had no way of even landing in the dark.
Could Quasar's alternate explanation open a new chapter in Flight 19's history?
I have the evidence that Flight 19 did continue to fly west. They did cross the coast near Flagler Beach and finally ditched in the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. I was able to get the Air Transport Command report that showed 5 unidentified aircraft near the swamp at 8:50 p.m. that night. Both Brunswick and Jacksonville reported 5 unidentified aircraft. That was relayed to Miami. So here you have 5 unidentified aircraft on that very night that never land. They never arrive at any port, and they're unaccounted for. One very crucial bit of evidence is that the carrier Solomons reported 4 to 6 aircraft crossing the coast on its radar at 7 o'clock that night when the flight was still known to be up. And had that flight ditched at sea, which is what the Navy claimed, it would have been on the Solomons' radar when it did so. That was dismissed.
Quasar feels that Flight 19, as well as many other Bermuda Triangle mysteries, should be scrutinized in greater detail.
It's important for us to investigate because these disappearances are real. The ships and aircraft disappeared. They existed in records. The people were real, we know all that, and they are gone. And an answer must be found.
Almost 60 years to the day, the Navy airmen of Flight 19 and the Mariner search plane were honored with a House resolution in Washington, D.C. Representative Clay Shaw of Florida said, "While the events of that day may go unexplained, the memories of those men will not go unrecognized." And he hoped the gesture would help bring closure for the surviving families. No matter how today's science explains the fate of Flight 19, there are some who will continue to believe that its disappearance remains part of a larger, unsolved mystery of the Bermuda Triangle.
We can put a man on the moon. We can split the atom. Surely, this tiny mystery off the coast of Cuba should not keep us in the dark for so long. But it does, and we have to ask ourselves why. What forces are at work, both natural, supernatural, that's keeping us on the other side of fully understanding what lies at the heart of the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle?
The disappearances of the triangle I attribute to human error, mechanical malfunction, weather or atmospheric phenomena. Those account for 90% of the disappearances. The other 10% of the disappearances I don't think we'll ever know about or ever discover the cause.
I don't think the Bermuda Triangle will ever be explained to the satisfaction of science or the popular imagination.
But to many, the Bermuda Triangle is more legend than truth, more myth than reality.
There is no real evidence available for the Bermuda Triangle. There are just a lot of stories that may or may not be connected with one another. I think that people who are predisposed to accept a lot of mythological explanations for things or supernatural explanations for things have no trouble connecting them.
I believe the Bermuda Triangle is a myth. I believe it's 3 imaginary lines in the water. These waters are no different than any other water up and down the seacoast.
There's a part of me that would love to see an alien come down. I mean, I'd like to meet somebody from another planet, but I really don't believe that that is causing any of these losses.
I think the Bermuda Triangle story is a lot of nonsense. Airplanes and ships disappear all over the world all the time. It has nothing to do with a particular location or area. If you look at the history of all these disappearances, you find that they're not confined only to the so-called Bermuda Triangle.
With only a few exceptions, Incidents that remain unsolved were incidents that I could find nothing for, which makes me suspicious of where did the mystery come from if no information can be found to verify that this ever happened. The less a person knows about a subject when they're writing a mystery, the better mystery they can write.